Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's webinar. My name is John Hamilton, and I'm the President of the Ontario Principals Council and Director of the International School of Leadership, a subsidiary of the OPC. International School of Leadership, or ISL, is dedicated to providing educational leadership training around the world. Today, we'll be interviewing Andy Hargreaves and engaging in a discussion about his new book, Uplifting Leadership. Further to our introduction, this live web-based interview with Andy Hargreaves is the second in a series of free online presentations that are being offered by International School of Leadership over the next year. The webinar series will feature each of the members of International School of Leadership's Program Advisory Committee, including Ken Leithwood, Lynn Sherritt, Avis Glaze, and Karen Edge. Our first live web conference featuring Michael Fullen about maximizing the impact of the principal is available on our website. Registration has just been posted for our next webinar scheduled for December 9 with Ken Leithwood. The dates for all upcoming webinars will be posted on our website as they become available and will be distributed to all those who have signed up with International School of Leadership. All right, with all that said, Andy, good morning.
Good morning, John.
Thanks very much for being with us this morning. As a key member of our advisory panel for International School of Leadership, and as an internationally recognized speaker and author of more than 25 resources on leadership and change, we are honored to have you here this morning. This web conference for educational system leaders from around the world is an opportunity for all of us to learn and learn more about your recent publication, Uplifting Leadership. So as we begin today, we'd like to start with a shared understanding and point of reference. Could you please tell us what you mean when you say uplifting leadership?
Absolutely. Uplifting leadership is an idea really that came out of the research done by myself and Alan Boyle and Alma Harris and a transatlantic team of researchers on unusually high-performing organizations in three sectors. So it didn't really drive what we studied, but was the outcome. And very simply, it's about bringing about uplifting ends, how you uplift the people you serve in terms of improving their quality of life and creating greater opportunities for them. And really how you do that by uplifting the people who work for you and work with you. So there's a kind of consistency between what you lead as the outcome and the way you lead in bringing it about. And this is unlike a lot of theories of leadership which tell you what to lead, like instructional leadership, but not how to do it. Or how to lead, like distributed leadership, but being sort of open-ended and vague about what you might be doing that for.
Okay. Could you give us an idea of what are the characteristics of uplifting leaders and uplifting organizations?
Yeah, uplifting leaders are able to uplift the people who work with them, to inspire them, to motivate them, to enthuse them, to support them, which is literally an uplifting movement. And there are in the book 6 ways in which they are able to do that. 6 factors that really are sort of opposites that attract. So they are able to articulate, to somehow bring out of the community an inspiring and improbable dream about where they should move next, and how it's a better place than the one that they are. But not just to dream in a fanciful way, but to do it with utterly relentless determination. The path they take is often counterintuitive and quite innovative. It's a bit different from what lots of people around them are doing, not perverse for its own sake, but it's an opportunity that other people have missed, and yet they will pursue innovation in a very disciplined, kind of evidence-based, hard-headed kind of way. They know how to collaborate with their competitors, which is interesting, whether they're a school or a school district, for example, rather than either collaborating or competing. They use data a lot, but they use it intelligently, thoughtfully, with good judgment. It's not It's not an either or between experience and evidence, but it's really how the two come together. When they work with teams, they're able to what we call pull them a lot, which is motivate, enthuse, inspire, intrigue. So drawing people into something that is interesting, that they want to get involved in. But they can also push when they have to, when the going gets really tough and people need a bit of a prod to get into the next place. And they're able to connect short-term gains to long-term goals.
Mm-hmm.
And they see a consistency between the two. They don't sacrifice one to the other. And these 6 things we found seem to be absolutely crucial.
Right. And they're not racing to the top is one thing that I remember from the book. And you're pacing things so you don't burn people out, and that their investment is more internal, so that they do buy in more readily to what the dream is.
Yeah, but we don't know what the opposite of uplifting leadership is. It's probably a good word, and I'm sure people here who are online now and on live stream have their own ideas about that. But no, it's not about what your ranking is. Right. It's not about just doing what everybody else is doing to a lesser degree. There's a new book by Yang Zhao on China called "Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Dragon?" and he says that if you want to be like China, the main thing to do is not copy China. That's the paradox. The ones who are uplifting tend to engage in kind of win-lose, cutthroat competition. They either bully people or they leave them alone. They're obsessed with data or they use no data. And that they tend to get fixed on the next win in sport, the quarterly return in business, or the test score in education.
Right. Okay. Speaking from a global perspective, as our audience includes educational system leaders from around the world, how does a community or organization achieve this uplift? So where does everyone begin?
Well, you have to begin with some sense of being restless about the place you're in. Because in some ways it's not serving the people you're supposed to be serving as well as it should. Mm-hmm. Perhaps because you've tailed off, perhaps because the context has changed. In education, your kids might have changed. Mm-hmm. Or the internet arrived 20 years ago. Right. And so the context just shifts around you a little. And so then it's really trying, the first thing is not to pluck a wild new idea out of the air, but somehow to find something latent within the community that is a big opportunity for everyone there to do something dramatically better for in this case the kids that you're serving. And we have many examples from different sectors in education, serving very poor communities. People believe that poverty shouldn't be some kind of terminal sentence for kids, that educators can also make a very big difference. Singapore, Finland wanted to be really in the midst of economic depression, decided that they will become global creative knowledge economies. And somehow that was already there. And the job of the leader is to kind of find it, articulate it, build a community around it, and then pursue it absolutely relentlessly. Right. And if you're going to do that, the second key thing is you absolutely have to know your people, and you have to take an interest in them. You have to be in and around them, and you have to believe that most of the solutions that are needed are possible with the people you have, not with other people you'd ideally want.
Okay. Pushing through obstacles too, and folks that are getting in the way or are resistant to the change or the new ideas is something that the leader has to be able to have the capacity to navigate as well.
Yeah, resistance is when I work with leaders a lot, and there's question and answer and dialogue. About the most predictable question is, I have a real problem with resistance. What do I do about that? My first answer is resistance is part of the job of leadership. It's not an interruption. If you don't have resistance, you're probably not leading. but because leading will at some points create discomfort, uncertainty, anxiety.
Sure.
And in the book we talk about, we're not the first people to do this, but we talk about moving towards a resistance rather than trying to quash it or run away from it.
Sure.
And a good example across several countries, your international schools won't have this in the same way, but is relationships between administrative organizations and teachers' unions, for example. And here in this province, there have been many years of teachers' disputes up till about 9 years ago. And the counterintuitive way the government decided to resolve it was to give the unions $25 million and say, not as a bribe, but say, okay, here's 25 million. You can spend it on anything you want, providing it's on professional development to improve teaching and learning. And that's created some very powerful collaborations between the unions, the government and administrators in ways that really benefit students. And we've got other examples of where the unions are the initiators of this kind of move. So it's saying, okay, we disagree on some things, but let's see what we can learn by moving towards it that'll actually bring us to a higher place in serving the people we're responsible for.
Oh, very good. Well, thank you. In your book, Uplifting Leadership, you cite examples from sectors including education, sports, and business.
Yeah.
What have you learned from doing this research that surprised you?
Yeah, well, for me, it was both a dream and a nightmare to move. In fact, for many of the team, to move out of our comfort zone in education. So it was very easy getting into education institutions. Most people know who we are and what we've done, and thankfully are glad to welcome us into their schools and their districts. It was much harder to get into business organizations, sporting organizations. We had few networks, contacts, little or no beginning credibility in that field. And the first thing is we expected when we went in there we would feel completely out of our depth, look at best utterly foolish, at worst dangerous, and that it would be very different and incomprehensible to us. So we thought going into an auto manufacturers and internet retailers, a Premier League football club, soccer club, the whole of the national organisation for Cricket Australia, we'd be utterly baffled. And the first thing we found was wherever we were, the conversations about leadership were almost always about the same things. Really? If you lead a large school district, you're leading something as big as a large sporting organization or some big companies, and you have the same concerns. How do you get it to hang together? How do you not go financially or morally bankrupt? How do you motivate, inspire people? How do you deal with difficult people? These are so the first thing that really surprised us was, and this is very important, is for all sectors to understand, including people who sit on your board and come from a different sector, that there's a space about leadership we all have in common, whatever sector we're in, and if we can find that space in common, and Peter Drucker said about 70% of leadership is pretty common, no matter what kind of organization you're in, and we really felt that, and we found that. So I think that was the first thing that surprised us. The second one is in other sectors, sport and business, which are all about winning and losing, profits and losses, how much collaboration there is, not just internally with their own teams and their own people, but how much collaboration there is externally, including with people who are technically their competitors. So with Cricket Australia, it was collaboration with India, who were their major rivals. With a Premier League soccer team in England, it was their hated rivals 10 miles away, but who committed themselves to anti-racism and community development in the same community. So I'd say that we saw a lot more collaboration in the other sectors combined with competition than we might have expected or predicted.
Okay, well, thank you. Andy, woven throughout this interview are questions from some international guests, beginning with David Fitzgerald, who is Senior Education Officer, English Schools Foundation in Hong Kong. And we're going to have his question come up in just a second.
Hi, Andy. My name is David Fitzgerald, Senior Education Officer with the English Schools Foundation in Hong Kong. My question today is this. In your chapter on push and pull, you refer to Clive Gibson's work on sports organisational performance. And you mentioned that Gibson found the performance of the team off the field had an impact on the success of the team on the field. What would be the educational equivalent of off-field performance? Thanks, Andy.
David, if you're listening, glad to hear you from Hong Kong. My son is a law professor in Hong Kong, so we come back and forth there at least once a year. The study you mentioned, which is a terrific study, very influential for us, of high performance amongst, I think it's about 17 sports teams internationally, was really helpful for getting us to think about the nature of competition and collaboration. And the Williams sisters are a good example in sport of people who are really strong rivals on the court, but extremely good friends and highly collaborative as sisters. Off the court, it's harder sometimes to think about where this applies in education, but one possibility is, especially in places like Hong Kong, Singapore, the competition between schools is not trivial for parents as clients, for fee-paying students, in comparison in relation to schools around you, and there are pretty clear measures and indicators for that parents and the public can see. So at one level, you'll have to be extremely competitive. At another level, the question is can you collaborate with those schools in other ways? How can you collaborate on teaching and learning, for example? How can you collaborate not just on sharing resources, playing fields, transportation, but how can you collaborate on things like leadership development or staff development? Because of two things. One is this serves a greater good, but secondly, if you collaborate well with people around you, you elevate the whole field and prominence of education in your community. You get more people interested, more people engaged. We have one case in our book of the London Borough of Hackney, which was the worst performing school district in England in 2002, now performs above the national average with still a very poor community. The schools are technically, indeed actually, competitors in high schools for student places and income. But one of the conditions of being an academy, as they're called in Hackney, is that you have to collaborate with other academies, including when they're struggling, and that is in your contract. And one of the interesting outcomes of this, which was not planned, was that when Hackney was the worst performing district, parents went out of Hackney and took their kids to other places because most of the schools in Hackney had little or no credibility or traction. And as a result of schools helping other schools, even when they were their competitors, what they found was that actually parents now kept their kids in Hackney. They regarded their best school as their local school. And indeed, parents started coming into Hackney from the outside. So by collaborating with your competitors, it's not just good for its own sake, but you raise the status, the prominence, improve the brand of what you stand for collectively.
Well, thank you very much, Andy, and thanks for the question, David. Moving on, our audience today, Andy, is made up of educational system leaders, from aspiring to experienced principals and vice principals to supervisory officers and government representatives, who are all keen to support school leadership development and would like to hear your perspective on how they can have the most organizational impact. So with that said, how would you suggest that school leaders can mobilize talent and ideas?
Well, if we're talking about school leaders, not system leaders, I think we're going to move on to system leaders a little bit later on.
Okay.
But if you're a school leader, if you tuned into Michael Fullen's session, he will have shared with you that the most important thing for a school leader to do is not how they work directly with students, but how they work with the adults who serve the students. Mm-hmm. This means seeing enough of what students do so that students know who you are and don't regard you as that strange person in the distant office, and you know who the students are as well, and you're familiar with what goes on in classrooms. It's not a mystery to you, and you can tell a really good lesson from a really bad one. But the best people to tell the fine distinctions in between are usually not the principal. There are other great instructional experts within the school who will be teacher leaders of all kinds. And the job of the leader is really to mobilize those other adults by keeping them focused on instruction, by getting stronger colleagues to help weaker partners, by building what Michael Fullen and I called social capital, professional capital amongst the community, because if there's always good ideas somewhere in your community. It's how you move those ideas around as a leader that really gets the kind of net worth or the net value of your school much higher in terms of its impact. And the way you break down, we'll talk about this as system leaders as well, but how you break down the silos in your school, especially if you've got a larger school, as some of the schools are in places like Singapore, Hong Kong, how you create communication across barriers. Many ways you can do this. You can do this by matrix management. You can do this by, often best by what the kids do, by having shared projects that cuts across disciplinary boundaries, or even across grade levels. But finding ways to break down the silos and get people communicating and collaborating more around a common purpose that you can see progress in over time. These are probably some of the key ways forward.
Andy, would you suggest that some jurisdictions have misinterpreted the notion of instructional leader as it applies to principals?
The short answer is yes.
Why do you think that is?
I think especially we're actually speaking in Ontario in Canada at the moment, and south of the border in the United States at the moment, the leader has in some ways almost completely disappeared. It's now, we know the teacher has the most important influence on student achievement.
Absolutely.
Within the school. There are factors outside the school, but within the school, the teacher has the most important influence. And unfortunately, the way that has dragged policy is to say, well, really the job now is actually to find and reward good teachers and to punish and remove bad ones. And it's almost as if the principal has become a manager of teachers' performance rather than a leader of the quality of what they do. So principals are really turning into performance managers, and instructional leadership is becoming, how can I evaluate a lesson so that if I need to fire somebody, I've got the hard evidence in front of me, rather than how can I get good conversations, commitments, and improvements going in relation to instruction by pulling together the people who know best how to do that.
Right. Well, thank you. With that said, how can leaders help elevate others in bringing forth and sharing their leadership?
Let's have some really specific ideas rather than general philosophy. If you start a meeting, say something positive at the beginning of the meeting. It's a really good way to start. If you're completely burdened and overwhelmed, don't start off talking by how completely burdened and overwhelmed you are, or how completely burdened and overwhelmed everybody else must be. Should acknowledge that at different points, but begin positively, praise some people for their accomplishments, talk about just in a word or a sentence how that fits with where the school's going, what it's achieving, how it helps move it along. Don't always praise the same people.
Right.
Because the others get really annoyed. Simple thing is always do that as you walk around the halls. Most ways you elevate people are actually not in big meetings. They're in things it's exactly as it is with kids. Things you spot them doing well that fit with where you're going, that show commitment, effort, accomplishment, and just show you've noticed that. And recognize that, and teach your teacher leaders how to do that with each other as well. If you want to uplift your parents and families, really encourage your teachers to call parents about something good before they have to call about something bad. This is, elevation is not one big, not one big elevator to the 25th floor. It comes about. It's an escalator, not an elevator, and it goes up much more gradually but relentlessly. And you are the escalator of your school. If you try to be the elevator of your school, you'll be disappointed.
Right. So we need to be mindful and reflective of our practice and our behaviors at all times, or as much as we can be. Anyway,
it's in what you do. It's important not to be a Pollyanna leader, because if people are really fed up, there's nothing that is more unbearable than somebody who goes around being relentlessly cheerful. So at times empathize with what people are struggling with and finding difficult. Talk about things you don't completely have a grasp of. One of the areas of focus for achievement around the world is mathematics. In many areas, many educators are much less confident about mathematics than they are about literacy, and that will include principles. So it's a great area to show. I don't completely understand all the practical applications of calculus either, and when you say that, it's easier for other people to say that.
Great. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Our next guest question comes from Dr. Charmaine Villette, Dean, Faculty of Education, and John Mushandia, Deputy Dean from the University of Namibia in Africa. And we are going to cut to their question in just a second.
My name is Charmaine Villette. I'm the Dean in the Faculty of Education from the University of Namibia in Namibia, Africa, for those people who don't know where Namibia is. And next to me is my Deputy Dean.
My name is John Mushandia. As correctly said, I'm the Deputy Dean in the Faculty of Education at the University of Namibia.
And my question to you, Professor, is what are the leadership enigmas to building trust among subordinates, given the plethora of diverse cultural groups in Namibia and our legacy of apartheid?
Now my question is, how do I lead my leader? Or how do I lead other people at the same level as myself?
These are two great questions, and both of them make me feel really sorry that I've never been to Namibia, is the first thing that I would say. But I have been on many occasions to South Africa, and my team has done some work also in East Africa. And the legacy of apartheid is also bound up with a second. They're related but separate, which is how you bring together different cultures within a school. So these are two kinds of problems compounded on each other. One is bringing together different cultures in a school. We see that in a lot of international schools. We've seen that in East Africa, for example, with expat cultures of people like me who come in from Canada, America, England, New Zealand, Australia, come across as confident, interested in learning, want to show off what they're learning, and can be perceived as being loud and boastful and taking up other people's words. And then there may be Indian Africans who have moved into the culture and have a much more quiet and restrained way of being, very often with different views of instruction. And then Africans who of course are not one culture either, but come from different cultures, different communities with different ways of being. So your first challenge is in any school, actually, you've got different cultures. How do you understand those cultures? So you, as a leader, you have to be a really good anthropologist, not prejudge, get to know your people, get to know the kinds of families, communities those people come from, communicate that across cultural boundaries, get people to work together on tasks in common, not just to, the worst thing to do is just to talk together, but to work together on tasks that produce a result they will all be proud of, to respect each other's skills and contributions, and to be prepared to stretch their own skills and contributions a little bit outside their culture at the same time. So the first thing is all about working across cultures, but then you've got another layer where that is complicated by there having been a dominant culture that has repressed and indeed terrorized other cultures that are now part of the school and the community. And for me, one of the most remarkable books I've ever read is by Jonathan Jansen, who is president of Orange University in South Africa. Jonathan's a larger-than-life, hugely controversial figure in South Africa, and he's written a book called Knowledge in the Blood. And when he wrote the book, I had to review it for somebody, and I wrote to Jonathan and I said, you need to be careful. You could get death threats as a result of writing this book. And the book very controversially says two things. It says that the closest group, the closest analogy to the children of Afrikaners, especially in South Africa, who were responsible for, not all Afrikaners, but many, for apartheid. The closest group to them in terms of how they are dealing with what their parents did are the children of the Nazis. And they experience the same kinds of guilt, denial, shame, in very complicated mixtures. And Jansen says this is the place we have to begin. But then we have to move on to a spirit of forgiveness, of engagement, and of understanding that in some ways this is a very deep psychological, psychiatric issue, and of recognizing that in moving successfully into a post-apartheid world, that everybody must be engaged and involved in that solution, and that a kind of tough forgiveness, which he writes about brilliantly, and he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, actually, as a metaphor for this, is a precondition for how to approach that. This the issue of lack of trust applies not only in places like Namibia, South Africa, but in Atlanta Schools District in the United States, where large numbers of principals and system administrators have been found criminally culpable of cheating on the management of educational testing in ways that have affected their own salary. They have been going through a period where whoever has stepped into the principal's role, there is no trust for the principal, no trust for authority, and the main challenge in that system is to heal and to rebuild trust. The second thing you mentioned here is how to manage up. So it's hard enough leading people in a way beneath you. It's even harder to lead people above you. But everybody has to do it because you're never the boss. Even the President of the United States actually probably right now doesn't feel completely the boss because Congress and the Senate tell him what to do in many areas and many respects. So leadership is always about managing up as well as managing down. It's more difficult in some contexts where hierarchies are very traditional within the culture, or even worse, where there's active corruption and self-servingness. So the answers are a bit different depending on the context that you're in. Wherever you can, do things like this. When the boss calls you into their office, ask yourself, what is my first response? And one can be, I often ask principals this, and one is, oh my God, what have I done now? What are they going to complain about? What are they going to make me do next? But a good response when you go into the boss's office is to think, great, I've got an hour with the boss. What do I need to talk about? How can I get some help for the things that I'm trying to do with my students or with my teachers? So some of the answer of leading up comes from within, about seeing that in some ways you're in charge as well as them being in charge, and be diplomatic, be positive, flatter them when they've done well. Bosses are very lonely. People don't go around gratuitously flattering the boss. If you're a principal or a superintendent or a dean, about 70% of your conversations are about what you've done wrong or what you have or what they want from you. So a boss just delights if somebody genuinely goes in and remembers to say, thank you for supporting this. This was really helpful. I noticed when you did that, that's made a big difference. So these are some of the things I think about managing up. Very important.
Well, thank you, Andy, and thank you very much for those questions. Just turning our attention to Ontario, what are aspects of sustainable success that we can learn from the Ontario success story?
Ontario is a province of 13 million people, highly diverse now. One of the most diverse places in the world, actually. And often held up as an example of being able to create success within contexts of cultural, religious, ethnic diversity, ability, disability. And really when Ontario began to focus, be about 9 years ago now, on improving high school graduation,
Right,
and also improving literacy and math achievement. More successful with literacy, by the way, than with math, because as an aside, you can't really change literacy and math all at once. It's just too much for people to deal with.
okay.
So what Ontario's now doing is actually, it's sort of done a lot with literacy. Math fell off the table a little bit And now it's doing, and it could have done that as a plan from the beginning,
Right.
actually. But it, unlike some other countries which really faked their results, it didn't go for spectacular increases of 5-6% every year, because the only way you get those kinds of gains are if you're a school, you can get them by nailing behavior or dealing with behavior very quickly, very firmly. That'll get you a year or so. You can get some quick gains by concentrating probably a bit too much on the kids who are near the proficiency cutoff mark, so you'll get some fast gains there. But if you're really trying to improve teaching and learning for all the students, and in some ways including and especially those who are to begin with quite away from proficiency, and even further away from excellence, then your gains are going to be for several years 2 or 3% a year. This is what we see repeatedly across all the educational systems that we've looked at in different parts of the world. Finland is a very good example. Finland in 1992, when it had 19% unemployment, didn't dramatically change its educational achievement in 2 or 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
It was a few percent every year. And if you do this, it's an indicator of steadily things are getting better. You're digging deep into the practices that matter. And what you'll often find is after about 6 or 7 years, everything will come together, and then you'll get a leap when everything comes together. Right. After you've been digging in for 6 or 7 years. Right. But if you get a big leap after 2 or 3 years, it's probably got very little to do with the nature of teaching and learning.
Right. So sustainable growth over time is what we're looking for then.
Yeah, and this is what our businesses and sports teams also do. They don't. Our internet shoe retailer refused venture capital because it would have put it into debt it couldn't repay, taken over control of its purposes, and wanted it to grow too fast.
Right.
So actually, we've got some very good models where you'd least expect them in the business sector of people growing sustainably and actually doing well through the global economic collapse at a time when their competitors, who had a much more fragile and indebted business model, were taking very big hits.
Okay, well, thank you. Can you explain what you mean by uplifting leadership being counterintuitive? And what do you mean by counterflow strategies?
Okay. This is in a way is another way to put it is it is important to learn from other people, but not to copy any one of them. So if you want to establish a network, for example, which my colleagues and I are now doing in the Pacific Northwest with 3 states, we've looked at a number of other networks, including some we've been directly involved in. Each one is different. You can't copy anyone exactly. If you do, you'll become very disappointed, because when you move something from here to here, the context is different and it won't fit quite so well. So the better thing is to learn from multiple examples. Look at the context around you. Find the core principles that are embedded in those examples, and then figure out what's the unusual opportunity in the context that these principles can be applied to. If I can put this to you as 5 questions, ask yourself these questions. What is a big opportunity that you see that other people have missed? So Catholic education, for example, that's been in a lot of trouble financially and in other ways in the United States for a number of years now. There's a network of Catholic schools that are now providing bilingual education which is evidence-based for poor immigrant Catholic students in cities across America. It's consistent with the Catholic ethos. It's against the policies of some states which are ideologically based, not evidence-based, making people learn English straight away. And it's an opportunity that other people have missed that helps them rebuild and reinvent their identity. We've talked about moving towards resistance as being a second possibility. If you see someone opposing you, where are the opportunities? What can you learn from each other? Third is to think about what's your greatest weakness and how can you turn it into your greatest triumph. So in this province, for example, indeed across almost all of Canada, one of our greatest weaknesses now is historically the education of Aboriginal First Nations populations. And I am one of 4 advisors to the Premier of Ontario, and who cares deeply about these issues. It's part of her own background and areas of study. And we would love it if in 7 or 8 years, people around the world in Australia, New Zealand, across the United States, other parts of Canada said, we're really struggling with how to educate. Where should we go? And people say, go to Ontario. Right. They're doing some of the most inspiring, impactful work that there is. And I think one of the other counterintuitive ones as well, which we've talked about, is how to not vanquish your competitors, but waste so much administrative time on advertising, marketing, and so on, but how to collaborate with them for a common good. So all these are counterintuitive. They're not perverse for their own sake. They're focused on how you best serve your students and how you lift up your staff. But they do often go against the grain of what people have expected before.
Okay, well, thank you. In our world of school leadership, how do we combine what you refer to as the soft processes of imaginative creation combined with the hard data of rigorous research?
Do not take this the wrong way. I am very good at starting things. Usually when I say this amongst administrators, that there's a groan or a smile goes around the room, because your school will be full of either, if it's really bad, it will be full of people who never start things because you're over managing the whole school. The other is if you want innovation, is it becomes full of people who start things but don't complete them. Right. So you get good ideas, good initiatives. Now they might be new things with technologies, how to use iPad minis, how to use the various platforms that we have on the internet. So there are, it's not hard to create an environment where lots of people start things. And the people who start things tend to hang around with other people who are good at starting things, but not with people who are good at finishing them. Right. And so the hard and soft area is to keep the culture that sparks ideas, but combine it with a culture that is the equivalent of bringing the ideas to market, so that they're successful and effective. The Dyson cleaner that succeeded the vacuum cleaner is a brilliant counterintuitive idea. It turns dirt into entertainment by making it whiz round at 400 miles an hour. It's a brilliant counterintuitive idea. But before it went to market, it took 5,176 prototypes. So if and the equivalent of that will be putting iPads into all your classrooms before you know how to use them. Right. And with a Dyson, only the dirt suffers.
Right. Right. Very good. Okay. Thanks. We have one more international question from Roberto Barrientos, and he's with the Ministry of Education in Peru. Can we have Roberto's question, please?
Hello, my name is Roberto Barrientos. I am working in Ministry of Education of Peru, a part of national strategy to improve outcomes in literacy and numeracy in other areas in elementary education. My first question is, your study and your book, you analyze medium and small organizations. In a big and complex organization like a big minister of education, is possible to develop emotional, social and spiritual uplift?
Well, Roberto, thank you for your question, and I recognize you as an eager and enthusiastic and very informed email correspondent as well. So it's a delight to see what you look like, actually, as well as how you come across on email. You've answered a very important question, which is, what is it like to manage and lead a very large organization? And if I could put this very simply, it requires really three things. One is you being clear in everything you do, that you live, embody, and not just talk about the common purpose that is important to all of you. And you repeat that over and over again, 1,000 times to all until you are like, as they used to say in the old days, like a broken record. And then it takes that many times for people to get the message very often. Second is to the measure of an effective organization is what the people with the lowest status in it do and say, and how well you know them. So when Sergio Marchionne, Italian-Canadian, took over Fiat Auto, one of the first things he did was to walk into the workers' toilets and to say, these are a disgrace. And they were. And we will fix this. We will do something about this immediately. So don't hang around all the time with the other members of the fellow elite, but spend time with your people at all levels. Show you're interested in them, you know about them, you care. Every person matters. When President Kennedy went to NASA and asked one of the cleaners what his job was, he said, my job is to put a man on the moon. And that's what everybody in the organization should feel. And then the third thing is somehow that has to be reflected not just in you personally and charismatically, but also in the structure and culture that you create in the organization. So if I can give a very concrete example, in Ontario a few years ago, they had a very inclusive special education strategy, which was that students of all abilities and disabilities should spend more of their time not being dealt with out of class, but in class with lots of support, where different kinds of teachers, including those with special education, certification and qualifications, would work together for the benefit of all the students. And the head of special education at the time this strategy started in Ontario, one of the first things that he did in conjunction with the ministry was insist on moving his office from a separate building into the main building, into the hub of the action, because symbolically what it said was, my office to the ministry is like many special education teachers' offices in their schools. It's away from everybody else. It's separate, it's different, it's lower status. So think about how your structure and and also the culture of the way that people work together at the very top models what it is that you want in terms of how people will work together further down the system, if you like, within your communities and your schools.
Well, thanks, Andy, and thank you, Roberto, for that question. We're coming close to the end of our time here, Andy, and I would just like to leave the last question being, what are three main ideas or takeaways that you think our audience of school leaders should take away from this web conference with you today?
From this conference is the first big one is, go back, do your job, do it to the best of your ability. It will not always be perfect. Sometimes, often you will struggle. Struggle is part of the nature of leadership, not an interruption to leadership. So don't get downcast or downhearted, but uplift yourself in the way you uplift others around you by constantly focusing on what can be achieved, what can be done despite all the obstacles in the way. Use everyone available to help you with that, including partners outside your organization, including those who may have been your competitors. And in the world of technology and data dashboards, use data to help you. Use a wide range of data, not just one or two indicators, because the best organizations in sports and in business create a picture rather than a ladder of data, but never underestimate the importance of your own judgment as a community through wisdom and experience in making sense of the data, so that it doesn't lead you to panic-driven solutions, but to thoughtful responses that will help move you all forward.
Well, terrific. Thanks very much. Andy, we really appreciate you spending time with us today and sharing your expertise and commitment to change and system change that enables improvements in action in both Ontario and around the globe. For anyone interested in learning more about Andy's recent book, Uplifting Leadership, we will include information on the website. We invite you to continue the conversation with International School Leadership and our Elite Advisory Committee through our website, our Twitter account, Facebook, and LinkedIn profiles. With that said, that wraps up our webinar today, and I wish everyone a great day. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, John.
All right.
Thank you.